Henry Hotze is a very, very strange case. He lived 53 years, but we know nothing about his first 20 years nor his last 20 years. But for a decade, from 1855 to about 1865, tremendous record in the Confederate military, foreign service, Mobile politics, into all kind of different things, basically. Hotze has been studied a little bit in compartments as a military man and as a propagandist, but I wrote this book to connect the two. Basically, he's a journalist at heart, but he's foreign born, yet comes to the South, where he is a very prominent speaker of racial issues, military issues. He uses his journalistic style during the war as a propagandist, which we can get into later, but basically he's in Europe trying to convince European powers to join the war effort against the Union. He came to America at about age 15. We don't know if he's by himself. We don't know why. He's in Alabama by the early 1850s. This man has a knack for meeting important people and using these people in his career as mentors, later as contacts. In 1854, a Mobilian, Josiah Nott, has a strange request. He wants this young man, Hotze, who's a tutor near Montgomery, to translate a famous work on race into English. This book was written by a man named Arthur de Gobineau in France. Nott employs Hotze to translate this book. It's a racial account that talks about how races are inherently unequal and can never be equal. Now, why is that important? Because in the South, people like Nott would love for that idea to take hold, then they could justify slavery. Nott, who's only 20 years old, Hotze, who's only 20 years old, translates the book, but basically hijacks the book. He writes an introduction of his own that's over 100 pages, in which this young man puts his own ideas about racial issues and puts his own spin on racial issues, which is odd for a young man like this, but that kind of introduces Hotze to more people in Mobile, and he starts to move in these more influential circles, if you will. This translation that's called The Moral and Intellectual Diversity of Races, he comes to Mobile in 1856. After the translation comes out, to mixed reviews, he then goes into local politics in Mobile. He, for a while, works as a secretary to a foreign ministry. A Mobilian named Elisha Fair is appointed minister to Belgium. Hotze, through his connections, lands a pretty good job as the secretary for that legation. He's there just a few months because there's no money to renew the appointment. He comes back to Mobile, where he starts to work for the Mobile Register. Around 1859, he works under John Forsyth, another prominent Mobilian, for the Mobile Register for a couple of years in the middle of the 1860 election. John Forsyth, the editor's gone so much campaigning for Stephen Douglas that Hotze fairly well takes over the paper for a while and does, again for a young man, does a wonderful job apparently, subbing for Forsyth. Also, it's odd for the South, but Mobile was a fairly moderate location. Mobile, for example, voted for Stephen Douglas, the more moderate campaigner, or the more moderate person in the campaign, mainly because Mobile was full of Northerners at the time. It's a merchant center. Mobile, we didn't grow cotton here, but the cotton shipped from upstate came through Mobile. Lots of Northerners lived here, so Mobile was more moderate, at least during the secession crisis. Hotze, like Forsyth, promoted Stephen Douglas, the more moderate of the four guys that ran for president in 1860. What he does basically is just carry out the policies of Forsyth. The editorials you read in that time period, a lot of folks thought Forsyth wrote, but it's actually Hotze writing these for Forsyth in the 1860s. John Forsyth was a Mobile politician and editor. He owned and operated the Mobile Register for over 40 years. His father is the famous John Forsyth Sr., Forsyth County, Georgia's named for him. His father was Andrew Jackson's Secretary of State, had served as governor of Georgia twice, so the Forsyth name is prominent. John Forsyth of Mobile is a National Democratic Party leader. He's very big in the campaign of Douglas. He's Douglas's campaign manager in Alabama. He's very big in the 1860 conventions in Alabama and nationally. He takes a role in National Democratic Party politics. politics. When the war is over, he'll be a big Reconstruction critic. At this time, Hotze is kind of his, almost like a mentorship relationship. Hotze realized in 1860 is only 24, 25 years old. So Forsyth much older. Hotze is kind of a young protege. It seems like the older men of town take in Hotze. They're impressed by his intellect, by his ability. He's very notable in that anywhere he goes, he stands out in the crowd. So I think Forsyth, like guys like Josiah Nott, Colin McRae, Jones Winters, people like this, they see Forsyth as a young protege who's bound for bigger adventures. When the war breaks out in 1861, Hotze belongs to the Mobile Cadets. The Mobile Cadets for years was kind of a social organization. The affluent men of society in Mobile joined the Mobile Cadets. They would drill, have annual parades, picnics, kind of a social activity. When the war breaks out, they volunteer their service in the Confederate Army. The next thing you know, Hotze and his fellows are sent to Richmond, Virginia, and then to Norfolk to set up camp outside of Hampton Roads in that area. Hotze, in this case, left us two very good first-hand accounts of what he did. He's only in the Army for 3 months, but in these accounts, one is called the Cadet Letters. He sends a series of letters back home to the Mobile paper. In these letters, he talks about mundane things, who from Mobile came to visit, what gifts they got, how the guys are doing in drill, things like this. But a year later, when he's in Europe, he rewrites the story. He writes a series called 3 Months in the Confederate Army. At this stage, you see his propaganda coming into play because it's the same story, but he knows there's a new audience, so he changes his focus. He starts to talk about big issues like the justification of secession. He talks about the legality of what they're doing. He talks about how the Alabama soldiers are aristocratic, trying to strike a chord with Britain, for example. So in his second series, it's the same events, the same place, but you can see now he's talking to a broader audience with a much different purpose, it seems like. I tell my students, when we talk about the Civil War at the University of Mobile, I tell my students that when the war starts, the best chance the South has at winning the war is an alliance with a European power. Hotze realizes this, as does the Confederacy. His objective, once he starts this new mission we'll talk about in a minute, once he starts this new mission, he's trying to secure some kind of recognition and intervention of European powers. So in these early writings, he wants to convince the European populace of the justness of the cause. He wants to convince these folks the South can win, first of all, hoping to sway the political leaders to recognize the Confederacy and hopefully, in that case, join in the war effort. This becomes the fascinating part of the story to me. In about 3 months of the Army life, he gets bored. He's got connections, as a lot of the affluent did, to try to find some kind of other assignment. He realizes early on, digging, they never go to battle, by the way, in his part of the war. The cadets will later serve, with distinction, but while he's there, it's pretty much clearing out brush, setting up camp, digging ditches, latrines, whatever. It's not glamorous work. Now, he in about 2 or 3 months, gets tired of this. He starts pulling in those connections. Guys like Colin McRae, these are big officials in the Confederate Army now, in political circles. He wants a new assignment. He gets appointed in 1861 in the fall to go to Europe to try to speed up the purchasing of supplies. They've sent guys like William Yancey, a guy named Roost, a guy named Mann, to work out some kind of deals to buy weapons, maybe supplies, whatever. It's going slow. He's sent to try to speed that up. When he gets there, being a journalist, he sees in the local papers all this anti-Southern propaganda. It's going unchecked. There is no Confederate voice. He gets an idea. He comes back to America, goes to Richmond. He goes to the Davis administration with what I think is great gall, tells the guys, we need this person to be a propaganda agent. And I've got just the person, it's me. And they fall for it. So in 1862, he's appointed to go back to Europe as a, quote, commercial agent. But his task there is to pretty much judge opinion and try to sway opinion in Europe on the war. Early on, after the First Battle of Bull Run, for example, there's this, in the South, expectation these guys are about to jump in. Early on, the South believes it's a done deal. They believe, for example, there's no way Britain won't take a chance at weakening a rival. If they could weaken the northern U.S., that's a trading rival. King cotton diplomacy is a familiar term. The South is convinced that if they threatened to shut off the supply of cotton, the British would come running in a heartbeat to come join the cause. It never happened in this way because the British leadership could never find it in their interest to do so. It was never worth risking war with America to help the South. It's a 3-year story. When he gets there, it's an ingenious plan. The papers of the day have editorials they call leaders, and they're unsigned. All of these leaders are pretty much anti-Southern. Just like in America, every newspaper was a partisan paper. So the prime minister has his own paper. Well, Hotze makes contact, as he always does. There's a famous line of how good he is at passing out cigars and whiskey to make contacts. He makes contacts with the writers of these papers. So he will write editorials that are pro-Southern. He'll give these guys to British writers. They'll in turn sell these to the London papers. So they come out in the London papers. It looks like to the British public, these are Londoners writing these things. It's a kid from Mobile writing these things. It's a guy from Mobile writing pro-Southern editorials that are now being placed in British papers. So the person reading that paper thinks, my countrymen feel this way, but it's this Southern guy writing unsigned editorials with the Southern point of view. In the paper, he's got several basic themes here. The paper, by the way, as I say, runs for 3 years every week, but the themes almost never change. First of all, his first big theme is telling the British of the material advantage it would be to support the Confederacy. What we said a while ago about the cotton trade, other trade, weakening America as a trading rival, he wants to tell the population that it's a great advantage to support the Confederacy. He would also talk about the blockade. The blockade was a sore spot with many Europeans because you're blockading the South, well, that's where their cotton trade comes through. So Hotze talks about the blockade, how illegal it is, and should the British put up with it. He would then talk about battles. Surprisingly, by the way, very accurate accounts, which you couldn't find in Mobile. In Southern papers, it's always the exaggerated victories, and we tell students when you do war studies, never use newspapers because they're so biased. His were fairly accurate. He would talk about things like eventually race. As the war, which is a good topic in a minute, but as the war became more hopeless, Hotze becomes more racist in his writings. He realizes slavery's gone, but he starts talking about, okay, if slavery leaves, there's still this basis for separation based on race. Some very virulent, very, today we would view it disgusting racial things, which goes back to his translation work from years ago.
How was it received?
Very badly. This is one of the reasons, by the way, that Europe never got in the war. After 1863, when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, that almost guarantees that Britain will not join the war. Don't forget, in 1832-33, Britain's already abolished slavery. Britain is a wage-earning, factory-working society, so there's not much chance they're going to help the South if doing so promotes slavery, because they're anti-slavery. So when Hotze becomes more and more racial, I think it's a desperation move. And I think he loses the credibility he had, he starts to lose, I believe. In the book, I conclude that there's a danger in what he says. This is also another strange story. Hotze never, when the war ends, he never comes back to America. So for the next 20 years of his life, he vanishes once again. There's bits and pieces. We know he married. We know he dies in, I think, 1884. So not much is known about him. However, years later, there's a guy named Ludwig Sherman. in Germany, an obscure name. He writes a book called Gobineau's, in English it's Gobineau's Race Work. Now, why is that important? This book was later lauded by the Nazis as a primer on race. Now, in that book, which the Nazis thought was a good example, so much so, by the way, that Sherman is later presented a medal by the Nazis for his work on race. In this book, he includes writings of Hotze. So here's the connection. This guy from Mobile writing on race is later referenced in German works that are later praised by the Nazis, who of course are the all-time infamous proponents of racial inequality. So what we say in words, they're dangerous. What we write, what we say can be dangerous. This sentiment is a dangerous sentiment. I do contend the South had little chance of winning this war, if it's a long war, unless they get an ally. So to that extent, the work Hotze tried to do as far as gaining recognition is valuable. If that had worked, there might have been a different outcome of the war, at least early on. Who knows? That's speculation. The other thing is the racial part. As the war becomes hopeless, you see not just Hotze, but a lot of folks in the South thinking toward that post-war world. They believe in separation. Slavery has been that legal separation for almost 200 years by this point. They realize that's going away. Slavery is dead. They still believe there should be some kind of separation. They could use works like Hotze to justify that separation. Again, very dangerous. But that, to me, is the impact of this book. It shows where that thought comes from and how dangerous that thought can be.